Coming to you on Secular Media Network, this is the Atheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I'm your host, Callie Wright. I am joined today by the lovely and talented Daniel Wolfsong.
Hello.
And the equally lovely and talented Jonathan Moore.
Hey!
We've got a great show on deck for you. We're going to start out with some atheist news. We're going to have a whole lot of fun with Conservapedia. And then we're going to spend most of the show talking about the Chapel Hill shooting, its implications for the atheist movement, and an LGBT connection that may not seem obvious at first. So let's go ahead and get started with some news. Mr. Jonathan, why don't you get us started?
All right, well, starting us off today, we have Brian Fisher on his American Family Radio program. Today, suggesting that Alabama judges are being forced into slavery by being forced to, follow the law and marry gay couples. Fisher praised Alabama Chief Justice Roy Moore for flouting the law and ordering probate judges not to marry gay couples. By the way, not related to Roy myself, so...
That's good. So my favorite thing about this is that in the immigration debate, you hear conservatives all the time talk about, oh, it's the law. If you disagree with it, try and change the law, but it's the law.
Yeah, unless it's the law they disagree with.
Unless it's letting gay people get married or whatever.
And I mean, first of all, words mean things. And
yes, they do.
Slavery is not being forced to, what did he say? Being forced to violate your conscience. That is not what slavery is. So there's that. But second of all, we're talking about the enforcement of state law. Okay, this, quote, gay Gestapo nonsense is just trying to take a matter of enforcing state law and somehow turning it into some kind of gay vigilante justice.
Well, it's the gay agenda.
Right, but this is a ruling passed down from the Supreme Court. You don't get to pretend that this is some ragtag fringe group of gay people going around bullying these state judges because that's ignorant, it's dishonest. And here's the thing. As a state judge, it is your job to uphold the law. Period. Judges don't get to ignore laws just because they don't personally like them. That isn't slavery, and that isn't tyranny. A judge who believes their own personal religious beliefs trump the secular law they're sworn to uphold is just in the wrong line of business. The same goes for those county court clerks that were illegally refusing to issue marriage licenses a while back to gay people just because that didn't vibe with their own personal religious beliefs.
Well, it's the same thing. It's the same thing that's been happening for a while now. The whole victimization. They're turning themselves into victims.
Yeah, it's the persecution complex.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, can you imagine the outrage from these same Christians if Muslim county court clerks refused to marry heterosexual couples unless the woman was wearing a hijab?
It's like a while ago when they tried to pass laws that would allow businesses to refuse service to LGBT people trying to get married, and then realized that they had written the laws so broadly that an atheist store clerk could deny service to a Christian, for instance.
Surprise. And the most egregious part of all this will be the last point. The most egregious thing of it all is I think that he missed a fantastic choice for some hilarious wordplay. And he has this whole concept with the gay Gestapo, right? Why not call us the Gaystapo?
The Gaystapo.
Because that would be hilarious. I would buy that T-shirt. I would join that group.
I totally would too.
I'm making that T-shirt.
Daniel, what's next?
Okay, so in other ridiculousness this week, conservative activist Janet Porter has released a new trailer for her documentary entitled Light Winds: How to Overcome the Criminalization of Christianity, featuring noted conservatives, former Governor Mike Huckabee, Representative Louis Gohmert, Representative Tim Huelskamp, Representative Trent Franks, and Senator Rand Paul. In the trailer, they detail the devastation of the traditional institution of marriage and the taking away of the state's rights to decide who gets civil rights and who doesn't.
And watching this trailer, it was like, I felt like it was like a 1984 kind of thing. Like, I know that's kind of a ridiculous like generalization or exaggeration that a lot of people make when they hear about stuff like this. But I just it's 2015, guys. I know they don't generally accept the, drawing the parallel between the, the Black Civil Rights Movement and the LGBT Civil Rights Movement. And, sure, there are obvious differences, but I mean, all the arguments are the same.
Oh yeah, and and you could play some kind of logical fallacy bingo game watching that trailer. But here's the thing, and
We
I
might
know
need to do that. A logical fallacy bingo game. I love that idea.
yeah,
That's
me too,
wonderful.
actually, or at least some kind of drinking game. I mean, there's got to be some way to have fun with this. But here's the thing, and I know this is going to sound controversial, but I will back up my statement with historical facts. The problem, one of the things that was noted in the trailer when he was lamenting, one of the speakers was lamenting the fact that what was once supposed to be a state right has now sort of been delegated to the Supreme Court, and oh no, democracy is in a tailspin. Here's the problem with democracy: the popular ideas aren't necessarily in the best interests of society as a whole.
Amen.
Well,
Amen.
absolutely. And I mean, that's why the government exists. Like, that's why it's not a direct democracy.
That's why it's not a direct democracy. I mean, let's look at slavery. Had the issue of slavery been left up to the states to decide, history would have turned out much differently than it did with the Emancipation Proclamation. And women's suffrage is another example of that.
Yeah, the marriage between, I mean, right now, gay marriage is actually more popular than interracial marriage was at the time that was made fully legal.
That's a great point. Yet you always hear people talk about, like, oh, society will get there. If you try and force it on them too fast, then you're just hurting your cause. And what people don't understand is implicit in that statement is like, okay, well, all the gay folks who actually have, I mean, wanting to get married for the sake of getting married is a legitimate enough reason to have the right to do so. But there are also people who are in legitimate situations with their health or with their financial situation where there are real world detriments to them not being able to have the benefits that married couples get. So it's like, yeah, okay, let's wait for society to get there and just let them continue to suffer in the meantime. Like, are you serious?
Yeah, and this there is a common thread through all of these when it comes to democracy not being caught up to where society should be, and that's when it's oppressive, when you have a disenfranchised group of people who are being actively oppressed and there being an active line of inequality there. That's what I think that's when the Supreme Court should be coming in, and instead of individual states. I mean, that's not some kind of travesty of democracy. That's why we have elected leaders and officials and authorities to make those choices, because equality is not always possible on the granular level of democracy. It's just not.
Well, the Constitution exists specifically for that reason, to protect the minority from the whims of the majority.
Right.
Like, it sets out these basic guidelines that say, okay, these are the rights that everyone is supposed to have. You can fight out the details, but at the very, at its very base, you have the right to free speech, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And if a majority of people decide, like, oh no, we want to take that right away from a minority, like, that's specifically what the Constitution is for.
Oh no, liberals that like the Constitution, I didn't know that was possible.
Yeah, well, And finally, in some much needed and totally unexpected positive news, we have a court in New Jersey ruling that therapists can't advertise their services for curing homosexuality. Why? Because doing so is an act of consumer fraud. Here's a quote from the ruling that I literally stood up and cheered when I read it. Quote, "The theory that homosexuality is a disorder is not novel, but like the notion that the earth is flat and the sun revolves around it, instead is outdated and refuted. The overwhelming weight of scientific authority concludes that homosexuality is not a disorder or abnormal. The universal acceptance of that conclusion, save for outliers such as Jonah, which is the organization at question in the suit, requires that any expert opinions to the contrary must be barred." On Tuesday, the judge also said consumer protection laws prohibit conversion therapists from advertising quote-unquote success statistics when there is no factual basis for calculating such statistics.
Yes.
Gentlemen, if there is anything that will make me stand up and sing hallelujah, holy crap, this is it.
Yes.
Yeah, seriously. And I don't know how well known conversion therapy is out in the straight world. I'm not sure that it makes a lot of news, and I don't think a lot of people realize just how terrible. I mean, even a lot of gay people don't realize how terrible it can be. Like in South Africa, just a few years ago in South Africa. I mean, this was 2011. those kids were starved to death. They were tortured. They were beaten. They were forced to eat their own excrement. They were tied to beds and not allowed to use a bathroom. I mean, this was all in the name of converting them, quote, into a straight person. It's a gruesome practice.
Yeah, and it's amazing to me just exactly how much professional and expert opinion bears that out. Like, this is not among people who like really know about this kind of thing. The idea that conversion therapy is at best ineffective and at worst psychologically damaging is near universal. I was a guest on Dogma Debate a few weeks ago, and when I was putting together my research sheet to send to David for it, I looked on HRC's website to see the list of organizations that have position statements that oppose conversion therapy. And I mean, it's every one having to do with psychology. They're all in agreement.
Well, it's of course it's a liberal gay agenda conspiracy. That's why.
Well, see, it's interesting. Homosexuality. There was a time when it was listed as a mental disorder by the American Psychiatric
Right,
Association.
in the DSM, yeah.
Long time ago,
the DSM.
yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, that was thrown out in 1973.
Yeah.
Even before then, mental health professionals were saying we can't count this as a disorder. And, thankfully, places, this is beginning, these conversion therapy places and the devastation they're getting a lot of attention now, thankfully. And now they're even being banned in some places like California, and that's pretty awesome.
Good. I think we need more of that in this crazy country of ours.
Awesome. Well, thanks, guys. That's going to do it for this edition of Gaytheist News. We're going to take a quick break, and we will be right back with more of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network.
Here's an excerpt from Fear of Physics by Lawrence Krauss.
A physicist, an engineer, and a psychologist are called in as consultants to a dairy farm whose production has been below par. Each is given time to inspect the details of the operation before making a report. The first to be called is the engineer, who states,
"The size of the stalls for the cattle should be decreased. Efficiency could be improved if the cows were more closely packed, with a net allotment of 275 cubic feet per cow. Also, the diameter of the milking tubes should be increased by 4% to allow for a greater average flow rate during the milking periods."
The next report is the psychologist, who proposes the inside of the barn should be painted green. This is a more mellow color than brown and should help induce greater milk flow. Also, more trees should be planted in the fields to add diversity to the scenery for the cattle during grazing to reduce boredom. Finally, the physicist is called upon. He asks for a blackboard and then draws a circle. He begins.
"Assume the cow is a sphere."
This old joke, if not very funny, does illustrate how, at least metaphorically, physicists picture the world. The set of tools physicists have to describe nature is limited. Most of the modern theories you read about began life as simple models by physicists who didn't know how else to start to solve a problem. These simple little models are usually based on simpler little models, and so on, because the class of things that we do know how to solve exactly can be counted on the fingers of one, maybe two hands. For the most part, physicists follow the same guidelines that have helped keep Hollywood movie producers rich. If it works, exploit it. If it still works, copy it. I like the cow joke because it provides an allegory for thinking simply about the world, and it allows me to jump right into an idea that doesn't get written about too much, but that is essential for the everyday workings of science. Before doing anything else, abstract out all irrelevant details. There are two operatives here, abstract and irrelevant. Getting rid of irrelevant details is the first step in building any model of the world, and we do it subconsciously from the moment we are born. Doing it consciously is another matter. Overcoming the natural desire not to throw out unnecessary information is probably the hardest and most important part of learning physics. In addition, what may be irrelevant in a given situation is not universal, but depends in most cases on what interests you. This leads us to the second operative word, abstraction. Of all the abstract thinking required in physics, probably the most challenging lies in choosing how to approach a problem. The mere description of movement along a straight line, the first major development in modern physics, required enough abstraction that it largely eluded some pretty impressive intellects until Galileo.
Fear of Physics by Lawrence Krauss. Find this audiobook and many more at atheistaudiobooks.com. The facts you won't hear in church.
Welcome back to the Atheist Manifesto. For those not in the know, there's a conservative alternative to Wikipedia called, appropriately enough, Conservapedia. And to get a taste of what it's all about, when you Google Conservapedia, and in the search results it comes up and it'll show you the page, and it'll show you the pages within the site. The first ones listed are atheism, Barack Hussein Obama, followed by the phrase reportedly born in Honolulu, Hawaii, evolution, homosexuality, and of course, examples of bias in Wikipedia. So Jonathan called me one night and he was kind of just telling me some of the joys of the ridiculous stuff in this site. So we kind of hatched the idea of having some fun with it. So we're going to do a segment, just fun with Conservapedia. And we're going to start out with the Conservapedia entry on homosexuality. So Daniel, read me Conservapedia's definition of homosexuality.
Okay, brace yourselves. Conservapedia says homosexuality is the condition of sexual desire or behavior directed toward a person or persons of one's own sex.
So we're off to a good start. At least they know what homosexuality is, right? So, Jonathan, can you read me some of the awesome headers of the different sections in the page?
Oh, sure. So we've got homosexuality and murders, homosexuality and bestiality, health effects of a homosexual lifestyle, including AIDS, MRSA, homosexuality and cigarette smoking, homosexuality and obesity, one of my favorites because I'm kind of chubby, and homosexuality and the suppression of religious liberty.
I just want to start off by saying that, it's really sad because people take this kind of thing seriously, but I just want to put it out there that the reason we're making this a joke is because if we didn't, we would just be depressed all the time. So
yes,
we have to find a way to laugh.
We laugh at these things so we don't cry about them.
Yeah, exactly.
And just so for you folks that think that Poe's law is at work here, this is a legit site. Although there is some evidence that there's people kind of trolling it, but it's hard to tell what's what, just because of Poe's law. So
one of my favorite quotes from this site, from this page, as I was looking through it. Given the many diseases associated with homosexuality, the biblical prohibition against homosexuality is arguably one of the many examples where the Bible exhibited knowledge that was ahead of its time.
Oh.
Checkmate atheists.
Yeah, you know what? They're right. I guess it's wrong. And I like under homosexuality and obesity, it says see also the article on homosexuality and obesity and atheism and obesity, because apparently they both make you fat.
Right, because fat Christians that doesn't happen,
there's
right?
There's no such thing, obviously. They're all svelte, they're all 6'5"
Right.
with blonde hair and blue eyes. And
it's even worse for me because I'm trans, bi, and atheist, which explains why I'm such a fat chick. So there's that.
I literally cannot read this. Like, the whole time I'm reading this page, my mouth is just like jaw on the floor.
Did you know that American lesbian women more than twice as likely to be obese than all other female sexual orientation groups?
So I guess, the point of bringing things up like this are that, a lot of people who are on the more progressive side of life are going to look at things like this and say, oh, this is ridiculous. But it's important to realize that the people who are fighting the hardest to keep us either in the closet or to deny us equal rights are people who believe these things, and are people who are teaching things like this and who can easily believe it, because when you demonize homosexuality and demonize gay people and make us into some sort of scary perversion, things like this are easy to believe. So these are, that we can joke about it and laugh about it, like we said earlier, so we don't cry. But these are sort of at the foundation of all arguments against that are actively trying to suppress us and keep us oppressed.
Well, and bringing this back to the to the religion side of things, like if you look at this, I mean, so much of this stuff is inspired by at least what people claim to be the correct interpretation of the Bible. I mean, obviously there are plenty of progressive faith communities who are very welcoming and affirming of LGBT people, and I don't want to I definitely don't want to lump them in together with these people because they are very much not the same.
Right.
But you are right. I mean, the people who are out there campaigning the hardest against us are most definitely the people who, I mean, they'll read this stuff, and even if they hadn't necessarily thought of it before, I mean, they're going to be the ones reading this stuff like, oh yeah, that's right.
I'm sorry, but under the homosexuality and obesity, I just realized they have a picture of Stephen Fry holding a birthday cake, and it says, Stephen Fry is a homosexual and an atheist. And apparently a fatty.
Right.
As illustrated by the cake.
By the cake, exactly.
You know what? Stephen Fry is a good-looking man, and that's I don't care what anybody else has to say about him.
I'm sorry. I was trying not to laugh, but that just got me. I just noticed that.
All right, so that's going to do it for this edition of Fun with Conservapedia. There is so much more that we could do this show for 15 years and probably never run out of material. So when we come back, we're going to spend the rest of the show talking about the Chapel Hill shootings and how there's kind of sort of an LGBT connection that may not be so obvious, that gives us a somewhat different perspective on this issue. More Atheist Manifesto coming up on Secular Media Network.
I'm Daniel Radcliffe, and I believe that reaching out for help is the bravest thing a person can do. If you are struggling and need support, call the Trevor Lifeline at 1-866-488-7386. It's free and confidential, and trained counsellors are there to listen 24/7 without judgment. To learn more about the Trevor Project's life-saving work for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender or questioning young people, go to thetrevorproject.org.
Visit secularmediagroup.com to see how we're changing the world.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. We're going to spend the rest of the show talking about the Chapel Hill murders that took place this week. By now, everyone knows about the Chapel Hill shootings, so I'm not going to waste a bunch of time recapping what happened. I've been doing a lot of soul searching these past few days. We as atheists like to hold faith communities' feet to the fire over the vitriol, rhetoric, and the acts of violence that seem to be inspired by it. I think it's incumbent upon us as atheists, rationalists, skeptics, the secular free thought community to make sure that we do the same thing. I'm not by any measure saying that we as a community do bear responsibility for this crime, but I do think it's important that we're at least able to honestly ask ourselves the question and honestly analyze the situation to see if there's anything as a community we can point to that may play some part in something like this happening. As members of the LGBT community here, we are very familiar with the fact that words and speech are not free from consequence. You don't exercise your right to freedom of speech in a vacuum. I feel confident in saying that people like Glenn Beck, Brian Fisher, Rush Limbaugh, and the rest of all of those guys have never directly advocated violence against our community. But their constant vitriol directed at us may very well contribute to the culture that drives some people over the top to commit those acts of violence that we in the LGBT community are all too familiar with. I think we as an atheist community need to be careful with our rhetoric. Again, I'm not saying for sure that our rhetoric when it comes to Islam contributed to this situation, but it's important that we be able to honestly ask ourselves that question. Would a man really kill 3 people over a parking spot if he didn't see them as somehow less human for some reason? If he did see them as less than human, I have to believe his underlying motivations had something to do with either their race or their religious beliefs. And of course, we all know that being an atheist doesn't necessarily make you a good person. I've met plenty of racist, homophobic, transphobic, and just downright awful people who are atheists. Many of us in the community do very, very well at making sure to make the distinction between religious beliefs and the people who hold them. And I'm proud of the atheist community for universally and unequivocally condemning these attacks, even though it shouldn't necessarily be our responsibility to do so. It's often said that atheism has no dogma. And while this is true in the strictest sense, we do as a community seem to pretty universally hold to the idea that skepticism, rationality, and the scientific method are in fact the best ways to view the world. Now, of course, these aren't dogmas. These are demonstrable truths. I just think that we need to work very hard to hold ourselves accountable in applying those things to situations that don't bode well for us and may possibly expose some problems with our movement. Our position as atheists is an inherently negative one. We've hung our hat on the position that the God claim is wrong. Given the world we live in, that's a fantastic place to start, but it can't end there. We need something to be for, not just something to be against. That's why my identity as a secular humanist is more important to me than my identity as an atheist. The two are obviously intertwined, but it's more important for me when thinking of my own frame of reference to think first of being pro-humanity before being anti-religion. Thinking of things in that way may help the rhetoric be directed where it belongs and make sure that it's not used to belittle and dehumanize people because we think they believe untrue things about the world. Religion can be dangerous. Fundamentalist religion in all its forms is dangerous. These ideas and ways of thinking must be opposed vigorously. But we must be equally vigorous and aggressive in defending human rights and defending the rights of all people to live free from bigotry, hatred, fear, and oppression, including those we have ideological disagreements with. #and rant.
I really love that you brought up your secular humanism because I also consider myself a secular humanist above being an atheist, just as you do. And it's for that reason. I'm pro-human. Being anti-religion for me is a function of being pro-humanity because to me, religion, at its best, it's unnecessary. At its worst, it's really harmful and can do a lot of harm to society.
Yeah, I agree too, and it might not be popular opinion, but that's why I have some issues with the whole quote new atheist movement. It seems just as full of as much hate as some of the religious institutions that that were hateful to us.
It definitely can get that way, and and that's because I feel as I get to know more and more people in the atheist community, from doing this podcast and just kind of reaching out to people. I've been embraced. Both, as a trans woman, as a fellow atheist, as, just a human being with something to say. I've got nothing but awesome, welcoming attitudes, and it's a great place to be. So, I think so highly of this community, and every once in a while I see people, banding together and they're saying, things that are really hateful. And that's kind of my fear, is that rhetoric and that vitriol might contribute to a culture where somebody who may not necessarily do it otherwise, they keep hearing all of this, poisonous rhetoric, and they run into a situation where they're in a dispute over a parking spot, and these people aren't really human anyway, so I can just go ahead and shoot them. And like I said, I'm not saying for sure that's exactly what happened here. I don't know. I'm just saying that I don't think that possibility is so out there.
Well, I think, we have to also accept the fact that Muslims have been vilified through propaganda for the last almost 14 years in our country.
Absolutely. And that's where when I talked about the not so obvious LGBT connection is, one thing that the LGBT community and Muslims have in common, believe it or not, is that we are a misunderstood, maligned, and marginalized minority. So that I feel like that kind of gives us and the LGBT community a little bit of a different perspective, because obviously, us three as non-religious people, we don't know exactly what that's like to be, discriminated against because, this terrorist act that killed 3,000 people, we shared a religion with those people. Like, we can't identify with that necessarily, but we can definitely identify with what it's like to be maligned and misunderstood, because, as much as we want to talk crap about, Islam and all that sort of stuff, I mean, the vast majority of Muslims really are peaceful people just trying to make it through life,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I always say I have no problem with anyone, wanting to believe. If it makes their life happier to believe in whatever they believe in, more power to them, as long as it doesn't interfere with my life and my happiness, so.
Well, and I think that's such a big misconception about the atheist community is I'm not necessarily trying to take anyone's religion away from them. I would like to, I definitely, I want to have that exchange of ideas, and I want to talk to people about why they believe the things that they do and why I think my position is the correct one. But to me, that discussion is entirely separate from whether or not that person deserves respect and whether or not that person deserves equal treatment and equal protection under the law. Those two discussions to me are 100% separate from one another. I mean, unless you're talking about someone whose religious beliefs include me being unequal, obviously that changes the tenor of the conversation a little bit. But if you're talking about your average run-of-the-mill, even marginally progressive Christian who, there are Christians who think that gay marriage is wrong, but will vote in favor of it because they recognize it's not their right to dictate the law to us. And I think I can respect that position. I mean, I wish they would change their mind, obviously, because they're wrong. But I think as long as they recognize that we, as atheists, as LGBT people, as long as they recognize our right to live in society and share the same space as them and have the same protection under the law, what comes after that, I think, is less important.
I think it's a really cool idea to have conversations with religious folks. I do that on a regular basis. I have friends who are Christians. I have friends who are Muslims. I have friends who are Buddhists, and while they all agree that I should have equal rights as a gay man, they can't hold themselves responsible for the teachings of their religion in other churches. And I understand that point. I think it's important to kind of evaluate, maybe on a more large scale basis, what religion's function is. And I think that it's fine for people to have a religion. That's absolutely fine. I'm not an anti-theist so much as I am just someone who thinks that when your religion begins oppressing another group, that's when it's wrong. And I'd like to see this conversation happen on a larger scale than just individual conversations, because it's fine for my individual Christian friends to say, look, I don't agree with this oppression of gay people. I think it's terrible. I would like to see there be a more large-scale conversation. I don't even know what the platform for that would be, but let's look at it in a larger scale and just to show that where even it's hard to see it's hard to see from the religious end of it, but religious beliefs have this way of rippling outwards, and what starts as, well, this is just my belief. I just believe that homosexuality is wrong. That's just my personal belief. Well, that ripples out into society and outwards until it results in violence and killing and to definite harm to gay people. So we have to have a conversation somewhere at the source of this, I think.
Right, and I think more atheists and non-believers should be invited to like ecumenical kind of interfaith dialogues. It seems like it's why is it just the religious people getting together? Why aren't we involved in those things?
Yeah, and I will say I have definitely heard of instances of that happening. I think it was Matt Dillahunty actually who talked about there was some sort of like interfaith religious conference, and somebody went out of their way to invite him to hear his perspective. And I was like, wow, that's awesome. And there's, plug, David will be happy about this. So there's the Texas Secular Convention is coming up. I forget the date. I'm a bad person. But they had the lady who's in charge of the whole thing talking about, why is it the Texas Secular Convention instead of the Texas Atheist Convention? And she said, well, we don't want to just have a conversation with atheists. We want to have a conversation with everyone who's interested in human rights. And we can't forget that there are progressive people of faith who are very interested in human rights. And so we want to figure out, we want to find people in those communities that we have beliefs in common with, so we can get together with them and affect change in that way. And people who are interested in a secular society, secular doesn't mean anti-religious. It just means that religious can't dictate it.
Right.
There is room for everyone in a secular society. And more importantly, a secular society makes things safer for religious people. Because if we have a theocracy that's one brand of Christianity, everyone else's brand of Christianity, plus the Muslims, plus the Hindus, plus the pagans, they all become less safe as well. So, your religious freedom as a Christian, as a Hindu, as a Muslim, depends on a secular society. Today's Be a Better Ally is brought to you by my friend and yours, Jonathan Moore.
And the letter A.
Bye-bye. Jonathan is going to talk to us about the concept of heteronormativity. That's a big word.
Such a big word.
Right?
I know, jeez.
Professor Kelly, Professor Jonathan, and Professor Daniel are going to school you a little bit here.
Mm-hmm.
So, for those that may not know what that means, heteronormativity is the idea that people fall into distinct and complementary roles as either men or women who have natural, quote-unquote, roles in life. It asserts that heterosexuality is the only orientation, or at least the only normal orientation, and holds the idea that sexual and marital relations only really work between people of opposite sexes. Jonathan, my love, my darling, tell us why this sucks.
I intend to, and I won't use any of those $5 words either. Look, I realize, to some people out there, I'm probably a failure at living up to the standards set out by gay stereotypes. I've got a somewhat long beard, and my sense of fashion is pretty lacking. I'm pretty schlubby, honestly, and probably my swishing skills are a little bit rusty, but still, why is it that if our sexuality is not obvious, if we're not, your Will and Grace stereotype, gay people are just assumed to be straight until proven otherwise. Honestly, I'm tired of having to come out over and over and over again. Instead of asking if I have a girlfriend and making me have to correct you, why not just ask me or any guy or girl that you meet out there if they're seeing someone with no gender implied, and let me tell you, assuming I'm straight is just embarrassing and awkward for both of us. And while I realize it probably works 90% of the time, it's not always right.
Well, and I can imagine this awkward conversation when there's like a bunch of dudes drinking and they're talking about how hot this girl is and saying all kinds of lewd things, and then they turn to you and they're like, right bro? And you're like, yeah, about that.
Well, I don't hang out with those people, but the bras. And then especially if you're hanging out with people like that, then it becomes awkward. For some reason, a lot of straight people seem to think that as soon as they find out I'm gay, that I must be checking them out or something. So I don't know. Sorry, guys.
Well, guys, that's gonna do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. Before we go, I want to let you know, if you're hurting, if you're scared, if you feel like no one cares, like no one understands, there is a community out here that loves you and knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you need someone to talk to, please reach out. I'm at Gaytheist Callie on Twitter. That's GaytheistCallie.
This is Daniel. You can reach me on Twitter at Daniel Wolfsong, DanielWolfsong.
And you can reach me on Twitter at Nerdcub, NERDKUB.
And you can follow the show at The Gaytheists. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. And last but not least, we are on Facebook at facebook.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. I want to thank my co-hosts Daniel and Jonathan.
My pleasure.
Yay! You're welcome.
Next week, we're going to be talking about the biology of being transgender with very special guest Rachel Nannon-Brown. I'll try to keep my fangirling to a minimum, I promise.
Please.
Until next time, Until next time, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network.